Oh, good morning, YouTube. Today's project, Talon has got a problem with this bike, and we're going to try to fix it. So, if you guys remember, Talon brought this to Daytona in the spring, and it was shortly after he bought it and decided to do the first oil change service on it while we're down there. So we drained all the oils out of it, and he filled it back up. We rode it, and we noticed that something wasn't right. We thought the clutch was going bad. It just didn't feel right when you were disengaging. We thought maybe some warped clutch plates or something, or a jagged basket finger or whatever, causing the plates not to slide properly. Turns out it was none of that. What we do think happened is there are two drain plugs in the bottom. Talon pulled both drain plugs, not realizing that one of them was for the transmission and one was for the engine. So when he refilled it, he only put oil back in the engine and not the transmission. Well, about 2 months ago, well, maybe even longer than that. It's been a while now.
7 months already.
Yeah, Zach was riding it down the road and it just locked up and stalled on him. And we believe it's the transmission that's locked up. So we're going to pull it apart and see. And that's when Talon realized that there was no oil in the transmission, and they put quite a few miles on it. Well, we realized shortly afterwards, and I don't know that we covered it in the video, that we realized that wasn't the case. It turns out there's actually 3 drain plugs. He pulled 2 that went to the engine, and the third one for the transmission he never actually drained. So it wasn't dry. He just hadn't drained that one yet. So the transmission was never the problem, and there was always oil in it. So we made a mistake there that I don't think we addressed throughout the rest of the video. All right, so we got to pull the engine out because this has what's considered vertically split cases. So you can see the seam in the case right there goes up and down, which means the cylinder's got to come off, the jug has got to come off, carb's got to come off. Basically, the engine has to come completely out so we can split the cases to repair the transmission. All right, guys, about an hour later, we've got the engine completely out. Relatively easy, you know, radiators had to come off. There's only 3 motor mounts. There's one here in the frame, one at the bottom of the frame, and then the swing arm pivot point went through as well. Of course, carburetor had to be removed. We just kind of left everything attached and zip tied it up there. Spark plug wire, disconnect the stator wires. Relatively simple. And of course the exhaust. Now in this, the exhaust was held on by the springs, so we just had to pop the springs, and we couldn't get the pipe out until we actually took the motor mounts out and got a little bit of wiggle in the engine to get the pipe to slide out between the frame and the engine. So we're definitely have to remember that when we get the engine set back in there, we got to weasel that pipe in past the shock and the swing arm before we actually install the motor mounts.
I mean, I don't know if that's going to fit KTM.
All right, guys, so we started tearing the engine apart, and because we got to split the cases, and just so you guys can see better now, you can see the split right here where it's a vertical split case rather than a horizontal split case. So we wanted to be able to pull all of the accessories that are under the covers off, and we got to the flywheel right here. We ran into a problem. We need a special puller. As you can see, once on the outside of these threads right here, it's a 33 millimeter by 1.5 thread pitch. There's a piece that spins onto that, and then we can press against the center to draw this off of the crankshaft. And unfortunately, we don't have that. We think we've got a friend that may have one in their shop that'll let us borrow it, but until then, we start taking off some other stuff. So as you can see, we've got the cylinder head and everything else pulled. But when we pulled the clutch basket off, which is laying over here now, we came to a realization that the transmission was spinning nice and easy. And this is when the head and everything is still on it. But the engine spins over for a while, and then it binds. You can back it up, and it'll spin for a while, and then it binds. And that's why Talon was thinking maybe there was something wrong in the transmission. But we have got the clutch taken off. So now the engine and the transmission, even though they share a case, are not mechanically attached anymore. And we don't even have a cylinder head on it or a jug. And we still can't turn it, but to a certain point, we figured out why. We got a seized rod bearing. So if you look down in here, you can see where the rod connects to the crank, and there's, like, when I'm doing that, you see the whole crank is turning. It's not free on the rod journal, so we got to pull it the rest of the way down still, which we can't do until we get that puller, and then we're most likely gonna have to put a new crank in it and rod. All right, guys, so we drove into Hiawassee, Young Harris area to Young Harris Water Sports, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, to Young Harris Water Sports. that's where Talon's friend Cody works, and the tool that he thought may work to pull that flywheel off did not work. It was too big, it wouldn't thread on. So we're kind of at a standstill now. Not much more we can do until we order the tool. And then, of course, at this point, we've definitely got to buy a gasket kit and possibly a crank and a rod, but we won't know for sure until we get it apart. Thing is, Talon leaves tomorrow to go to Missouri for a personal event. And then when he gets back, he's meeting us in Daytona. And then we got to go do Panama and then Galveston to end out our season. So this project is going to get curbed for right now, or tabled, whatever. It's going to get set on the back burner because we just don't have what we need to move forward with it. And there's no way to get what we need before we got to go. So I hate doing that. That's how projects get started. And in our case, a lot of times they never get finished.
One eternity later.
All right, guys. So it's been many, many weeks since the last clip you saw. Talon and I have gone to Daytona, Panama, Galveston, and Massachusetts. And now we were back here in the shop trying to get this KTM put back together, even though we haven't even got it all the way taken apart yet. So if I remember correctly, in the last clip, we got to a point where we needed a special puller to pull the flywheel off. So Talon had ordered that puller just before we left on that trip. And all excited when we got home to be able to finish this project. And when we got home, found out that the puller he ordered wasn't the right one. So he ordered 2 more. And apparently neither one of those were the right one. So we went all over the place trying to find anything that had the proper thread in order to do it. Turns out it's a 26 millimeter by I believe 1.5 thread pitch. And believe it or not, it doesn't exist anywhere that we could find. We tried every auto parts store trying to find like an axle nut for a front wheel drive metric car. No luck whatsoever. So finally we found a listing that was specific to the KTM, had the right measurements, we believed, even though we thought the first ones did as well. And he got that on yesterday. We finally got the flywheel off of the engine. So the engine's still sitting here. Now we're going to do the rest of the disassembly. So now Talon owns a assortment of pullers. Hopefully he'll be able to put them to use at some point. Most of them were relatively inexpensive. So it wasn't like a huge deal to have them. They were like 30 bucks a piece or something. It was just trying to find the right one. And I know we should have done a better job at measuring it, but when we were here in the shop, all my precision measurement tools are actually up in Goliath. So we were trying to kind of guess what it was and doing researches and going on forums. And believe it or not, we got a lot of bad information on the forums. So be careful of what you see on the internet. It's not always true. Okay, guys, starter is off. The slave cylinder for the clutch is off. Drive sprocket is off. All the chain tensioners. All of the case bolts that hold the whole assembly together. So now we're getting ready to tap on our pry points and see if we can break the seal loose on this gasket and separate the cases. All right, after a careful separation of the case, we can now see the entire transmission assembly as well as the crank and piston. And you can see the transmission case, how nice and clean it is. And the crankcase, definitely pretty nasty with the metal debris in it. All right, as you can see, we got the crankshaft out, but I want to make a note here. You can see how hot it got right there. You can see the discoloration. The entire rod is discolored. Even the top is dark and burnt. If you look down in here, you can clearly see where the bearing has failed, and part of the bearing cage is actually outside of the connecting rod. So here is my concern. Talon purchased a new connecting rod with the actual rod journal, the bearing, the whole assembly. But it isn't so easy to just replace. It looks like this crankshaft is pressed together. Some crankshafts are pressed together and you have to true them, and I don't have the truing stand to properly true it. And other crankshafts can actually bolt together. We were hoping it was a bolt together. Keep in mind, we've never done with these KTM engines before, so it was a learning experience. So I'm not convinced that we're going to be able to fix this as what we have here today. And I'm concerned that maybe we need an entire new crank, only because trying to get the crank out of that far bearing, we literally had to use a hammer to get it to come out of there. And we shouldn't have had to. Usually the crank should just slide into that bearing assembly, and then the other case went on nice and smooth. But so I'm wondering if it's tweaked or bent or something. even swole, you know, from being overheated. I don't really know for sure, but I know it shouldn't have taken that much force to drive it out of there. I mean, we did so without damaging it. We were very careful about it, but I mean, I was swinging a hammer pretty good, and it was just slowly nudging its way out, which is not typical. At least I don't believe so. Again, never done this engine before. This could be typical for this engine, but I have rebuilt a lot of engines before, and I've never had to drive the crank out with a hammer, ever.
Pause. Make sure that's clearing the shaft.
Nope, not.
I mean, as of right now, it's not touching, but I don't know how much farther. So maybe if you just back it up and then put a space between there.
All right, guys, so we don't have the proper KTM jig, so we just kind of fabbed up a spacer here and a couple blocks to keep everything well supported as we try to drive that crank pin out. Well, I'm sorry, the rod pin out. The problem we're having is because that rod was actually seized on there, we're trying to overcome that tension as well as the actual press fit into the crank weight. So it's taken quite a bit of force to get it out of there, and I'm hoping we're not ruining something that's already ruined, but who knows. All right, our crank is now in 2 pieces, but we still got the rod on the journal with all of its mess there. All right, so now we are resetting up to continue pressing that out, get all this aligned nicely, because the pin is still seized in the connecting rod, so we can't get it to come out any further. Oh, guys, I didn't get the camera turned on, but yeah, once it got to a certain point, it just popped, and there we go. The connecting rod is now loose, but we still have to drive the pin the rest of the way out because we're putting a new pin in it. All right, guys, now that we got all the pieces separated, you can see the gnarly damage here. This is the bearing cage that just got hot and melted and oozed its way out. The inside of that connecting rod is just absolutely destroyed. But I think we can salvage the crank. There's a little bit of scoring on the inside of there where we had to press it out. And the scoring itself was somewhat unavoidable because as we pressed that rod to get the top part of the crank off, it had to slide through that trashed bearing and connecting rod, which scratched that journal pin. So as it went into the other crank piece, that damage on there transferred into there. But luckily, that's not a moving part. As long as we can still press it together and it stay fit, and in theory, with it being grooved, it should be like teeth. It should almost fit good. As long as you don't try to hone it or anything to make the hole any bigger, I'm hoping that we'll be okay with it. Truth is, the right thing to do here would probably be to replace the crankshaft. But Talon likes to do sloppy mechanics sometimes, and even though I don't necessarily endorse it, we're probably going to do what we can to reuse this and see how long it lasts. All right, guys, now that we've cleaned up the part, we're getting ready for reassembly. One of the things that's very important is there is an oil galley on the pin, and it's got to line up with the oil galley in the actual crank flyweight. So if that's not lined up, it could cause an oiling problem. And the thing is, we didn't check that before we pressed this out. That may have been the whole problem. Maybe the last person that did this didn't line it up, because we have determined this is not the original connecting rod in here. It is not the KTM part number. In fact, it is the same exact aftermarket connecting rod that Talon is putting back in. Same name, same part number on it. So somebody's definitely been in here before, as we could tell by some of the witness marks and some of the fasteners as we were taking it apart. So the key here is to line up those oil galleys properly and then get this pressed in nice and straight until it hits the stop, and then we got to put the other part together. So we're going to try that now. All right, guys, so we got the one pin in, and we believe we got the hole lined up, so we're going to check it to make sure that there's good oil.
Oh my God, I didn't hit record.
Are you serious? Really? You had one job. One job. Now we're just wasting brake fluid. All right, sure.
I'm actually recording.
All right, go ahead and see if it flows through. Ooh, look at that. We got a squirter. All right, so now we have to assemble the bearing and the connecting rod. So got some AMSOIL here. We're going to lube up this bearing before we install it. And then we'll try to press the other half on. And we got to keep the other half as straight as we can and then try to true it. All right, oiled bearing and connecting rod in place. Nice free movement on it. So now we've got to align the top flyweight and try to press it on there. There are some holes in the flywheel, and we're going to try to rig up a guide system to keep it relatively straight. It won't be perfect, but it'll be relatively straight so that when we go to true it, it'll be as close as possible. All right, guys, in an effort to find a guide to help us keep this as true as possible since we don't have the actual KTM fixture, I found this jack handle, and on this end, it was knurled for grip. And this is something a typical like 2-ton floor jack. It almost fit in the hole, but not quite. So I actually went to the bench grinder and ground it down about 8 inches in length, and then hit it with some 80 grit sandpaper. Now, I make that sound easy, but it's probably been half an hour of grinding and sanding and test fitting along the way many times. But now it fits in relatively easy. As you see, this side's got the taper to it, but when I put it in, see, it would stop at the taper. So I tapered this side longer, and it now fits in there, but there's almost no play in it, and it moves in and out fairly smooth. So hopefully we'll be able to keep those two lined up with that. And then Talon found this one that will fit with a smaller hole right there, which has got a pretty close fit. So with those two in place, going through both pieces, we should be able to press this on and keep it relatively lined up. So even though I don't have a machine shop at my disposal, sometimes you can get creative and make things. Now, I wish I would have had a lathe. That would have made it a whole lot easier to just chuck it up on a lathe and cut a couple passes off of it. The grinder is extremely unprecise. And this was just a bench grinder. So I just had to slide the thing back and forth while the wheel was spinning, and just try to cut it as even as I possibly could. And then all the little high spots and ridges I took out with that sandpaper. All right, guys, here is our jig up method. So Talon's got that guide in there. We've got the other one in the back, and we've got the pin lined up. We're gonna just get it started to where this squares up, and then double check our alignment, and hopefully it'll all work. Well, guys, as you can see, the KTM is no longer on the lift. We did not get it finished. And, you know, a couple nights ago when we were recording that, you saw we got the crank put back together. We were having a difficult time in the truing process because we really don't have the equipment for that type of stuff. So Talon and I played with it a little bit longer. Talon spent even more time on it than I did, and it just didn't work. However, Talon has moved back to Florida, and he was taking the KTM with him. The whole goal was he really wanted it done before he left. Unfortunately, that didn't happen. So later that night, he just packed everything up and took it to Florida. He's found a shop down there, I believe, that's going to be able to do the truing process on the crank. And then he is going to have to continue that video. So for now, we're going to end it here. Hopefully, Talon will continue the video when he finishes the process. And I don't know whether he's going to send that footage to me to put on this channel, or if you're going to have to go to his channel and watch that. Those of you that don't know, Talon does have his own channel. He really hasn't posted much on there in the last couple of months, but he's got a definitely different style than what we have here, but he's got some pretty good content. So stay tuned for that, and I will definitely let you guys know when that happens. But for now, we're going to say goodbye. Thank you for watching, and until next time, see ya. Keep those engines running if you can.